So many of you joining and welcome to you all. We've got a few attendees still to join, so nice to see a number of you coming online now. Whilst people are still joining us, let me just run through a little bit of housekeeping with you all. As you will have seen, we are recording the webinar and we will have it live up on our YouTube channel a little bit later on. So if you do need to duck out for something, or you can't stay for all of it, or indeed you want to share it with some of your colleagues later on, you'll be able to do that through our YouTube channel. We've got a great lineup today, and we'll be delighted to take questions from you all for our panel discussion a little bit later on. So please do ask questions. If you can, ask them in the Q&A box, which you have before you. Please do keep your questions coming. Feel free to ask questions at any point during the presentations or indeed the panel. We will come to them all in the panel session, but please keep them coming. You've also obviously got the chat function. If there's a technical question that you want addressing, please do just drop that in the chat function for us. At the end of the event, you should be taken to a survey page where you'll be able to answer a few questions about what you thought of the webinar, but also make some suggestions if there are topics that you think would be good for a future webinar, or indeed if you're on today and you've got a project or a scheme that you'd like to talk about at a future webinar, please do get in touch with Yvonne or myself. We'll be keeping our webinar program running. Hopefully as we get back to real life events as well, but in parallel. So please do come forward if you have a topic or something that you'd be interested in hearing about, and we'll be happy to try and drop that into a future session. And we have got a number of webinars coming up over the next few weeks on our website. We've got a really important one on the Williams-Shapps plan for rail and rail reform on the 23rd of June is our next one. So if you're interested in that, we can get the registration details to you, or you can have a little look on our website. But back to today and today's topic and today's webinar. And really, I think we can be in no doubt that strategic rail freight interchanges have been really instrumental in driving growth in rail freight over the last decade or more, in fact. And Dave Meller from Prologis is going to be talking to us about DERFT a little bit later on, but Daventry was close to opening when I first came into rail freight, and has perhaps driven that revolution, but with many other sites now coming forward in active use or indeed in planning. And newer sites such as iPort and the East Midlands Gateway, which have opened in the last few years, all generating new trains from the get-go, and increasingly successful in bringing rail and warehousing closer together. And we're also seeing similar trends in ports, with co-located warehousing at port sites such as Teesport and London Gateway, helping to build up a network of facilities across the country, alongside conventional intermodal terminals and other facilities that have been around for a little bit longer. As well as the sites that we've got a number of sites which are actually under active construction now, including places like Northampton Gateway, Moss End International Rail Freight Terminal, and Four Ashes West Midlands Interchange. And we know of a number of other sites which are in pre-planning at the moment and waiting to go into the planning system fairly soon. So there's a great excitement around this and its potential to really stimulate growth and bring new customers onto rail. In fact, there's even a reference to strategic rail freight interchanges in the recently published Williams-Shapps plans for rail, which notes that government or possibly Great Britain Railways will explore ways to enable future SRFIs to be located more appropriately around the country, really with an eye to those parts of the country where we know that we're possibly underserved compared to other areas. And so I think it's really timely today that we start to have this discussion about SRFIs, about how they are helping to satisfy demand for warehousing, but also demand for rail freight, the commercial case for these facilities, the market case for these new locations, the impact and interface with rail capacity on the network, and indeed with rail reform, and where in the UK we need to supplement that capacity and look to new and possibly different models of SRFIs to really help us drive forward that growth. So I think it's a really exciting topic, and we've got a great lineup of speakers today. Our first speaker is Peter Frost, who's the Managing Director of Kilbride. Peter spent most of his life working in rail freight logistics and in terminals and interchanges. And Peter's going to be talking to us, giving us an overview of the UK warehousing market and future demand, and the role of SRFIs in meeting retailer needs. So without further ado, Peter, can I hand over to you to take us through those topics, and many thanks. Peter, you should be able to share your slides, hopefully.
Yeah, I'm just trying to share the slide.
Big green button.
Yeah, I'm looking for the green button again. Apologies, 1 second, please.
Is it stopping you doing it?
I'm just getting the thing up. Sorry, it's a bit slow.
Won't be any slower than the Wi-Fi I've got in the office today, so.
Yeah. There we go.
Brilliant. We can see that now.
That's it.
Yeah, just drop it onto slideshow. That'd be perfect.
Yep.
Perfect.
Lovely. Wonderful IT. Right. Good afternoon, everyone. As Maggie just said, I run Kilbride Group. We are specialist rail developers linked to property development. I'll just show you some of the example projects that we've been involved with. The team's developed Corby Rail Terminal, the original car terminal there in the UK. We also did the 2 JLR rail terminals at Halewood and Castle Bromwich, as well as the one at BMW Oxford. We currently own the car terminal that we have a long lease on at Key Point Rail Terminal in Swindon, which sits between the Honda car plant and the logistics warehousing. For the last goodness knows how long, I've also been responsible for leading the West Midlands Interchange SRFI through the planning system, which got consent in May last year. And we've been busy over the last few months getting ready, gearing up for the delivery process. So this is an SRFI that is delivering 8 million square feet of warehousing and a large intermodal terminal. Our funders for the planning process have been Grosvenor Group, been fantastic, and the joint venture is between Kilbride, Grosvenor Group and the local landowner. So what are SRFIs? I mean, they are a very significant success story for the rail freight sector. Typically, there would be warehouse developments of about 5 to 8 million square feet with a large new 750 metre intermodal terminal at the core of it. Developments usually generate between 10 and 15 new freight trains per day when fully operational. Some are more than that, having been going for longer, but generally they take about 10 years to get to that level. The original industry forecast prepared by MDS for Network Rail in 2013 identified a number of potential SRFI developments across the country and incorporated those into the forecast for an unconstrained view of the impact on capacity up to 2043. Which was also instrumental in helping the NSET planning system deal with quite a large number of applications since 2008, which are still ongoing, and new developments are being put forward all the time. Most importantly for the rail freight sector, the developments are generating the levels of traffic that many of us had hoped for, principally as a result of making sure you have very significant large-scale customers immediately next to the rail, thereby cutting out the extra trunking leg that has proved to be difficult for rail freight economics to overcome in the past. That's not proving to be a difficulty at the moment. So we're just going to look at next the level of demand, both past and future, principally for the warehousing sector, because this then feeds on to the strategic rail freight interchange rail operations and how that level of demand is panning out across the country. Savills, probably many of you know, Savills have done a regular big shed review briefings. They update their data on a regular basis, make it available to the market. So I've tapped into their resources here, and they've this is based on the January 2021 review for the past few years. So it's pretty up to date. And it shows really clearly that the take up and demand for warehousing are at record levels. The type of demand has been changing recently, but the supply of the grade A stock has, at the same time as demand increasing, it has been reducing, which again increases the economics, the financial case for SRFIs. So there's a significant development in the market economics for warehousing. The type of warehousing demanded over the last few years has changed, and that they're looking for larger footprint warehousing to take advantage of economies of scale and to take advantage of new technology in racking and automation systems which require this. As you won't be surprised, the local planning system has failed to allocate sufficient land for this type of development, while the concentration has been virtually solely on the impact of residential housing on the local plans. In the background, the financial economics, the financial case for SRFIs from investors is also proving to be extremely hot. The yields that you see on this graph are continually going down, making these some of the SRFIs some of the most profitable developments in the property industry. And there is pressure on capital worldwide to find the most profitable developments to invest in, and as a result, the warehousing sector and SRFIs in particular have done particularly well and are forecast to carry on at that level. From here, there's a section in the Savills report on each of the regions, each of the sectors. So all I've done here is, in the interest of time, I've just taken the headlines from each of those sections, and you can see here that there's a fairly consistent picture right across the country with some differences, but we'll go on to talk later about the location of the warehousing and the SRFIs. Another report produced by the British Property Federation, I've been involved in the industrial committee there. They've produced a report saying what warehousing where, which is pretty descriptive of what the report contains. But I've included two slides in particular here because it highlights some of the new extra demand that's come into this sector. The first obvious one, which you'll all be familiar with, no doubt, is the rise of e-tailers, the internet retailers, and you can see the percentage here in the graph of internet sales as a proportion of the total retail sales. This chart only goes up to 2018, but as you can imagine, that graph continues on up, and as a result of lockdown, it'll be interesting to see what happens in the next report, but I suspect that acceleration has just continued exponentially over the last year. The other key factor here in increased demand, which is probably less known about, is the rise in residential development. Now, in the last few years, government has tried to achieve a target of 200,000 to 300,000 new houses by year, and that remains a top priority for the government and no doubt for other parties as well. The report that the British Property Federation did identified that for every new house that's built, there is a demand for roughly 69 square feet of warehousing floor space in order to service that home through internet sales and general retail sales. So if you multiply that up over the 300,000 new houses forecast per year, that generates 20.6 million square feet of warehousing annually on its own without any other changes to the sector. So trying to find locations for these warehouses and the big plots that are needed on highways, on the main trunking routes and on the main rail routes is not an easy task. I mean, land is at a premium anyway, but you can see from this plan how each of the main conurbations that the warehousing is intended to serve is surrounded by either greenbelt or AONB designations or a combination of the two, which means land is protected from development, and it makes it very difficult to find allocated land within local plans that can be taken forward for warehousing and SRFIs. As a result of this, quite a few of the SRFIs have been going through the national infrastructure process, the planning process for that, which was set up under the Planning Act 2008. So the next step, trying to look at how that demand for warehousing has affected the rail freight operations and how that in turn then impacts on the rail network itself. But it's very clear that there's a very significant driver here for modal switch to rail resulting from these SRFI developments. And that is likely to continue at significant pace. This slide, I've tried to squeeze in as many of the SRFIs that have been consented or proposed, either in England or Scotland at the moment, principally because these are where the main developments have occurred so far. You'll see that the blue listed SRFIs are already consented. Some of those are under construction and underway. Others are about to start or just starting, such as West Midlands Interchange, where we're at the point on the cusp of looking to implement the consent and take forward the development. But there are a whole range here from Durft, which is probably the longest established and one of the first SRFIs, which David will talk about later, ranging through to Radlett and the proposed schemes that are listed below. There are many others that are probably under discussion as well, but you'll see that the existing proposed SRFIs are located on either the best rail network, so the strategic freight network, as well as on the main road trunk routes up and down the country. So the map shouldn't be a surprise, but you can see some concentrations and some gaps in some of the markets, which we'll talk about in the panel at the end. Here's the gauge network. So W10 is not the minimum requirement under planning rules, it's W8, but W10 from a practical point of view is key to any viable rail service. And you can see that from the previous map of the SRFIs, they are located obviously in the key sections of the West Coast Main Line and starting to go up the East Coast Main Line as well now. So the demand, how does that translate onto the network? So Durft 1, 2 and 3 forecast roughly 33 trains per day, which would include a transfer of 10 trains per day from Durft 1 from the existing rail terminal there. So that is a very significant number of new paths. The construction is underway, I gather. iPorts up in the northeast is also forecast to 10 trains a day, but it's a good indication of some of the latest success stories of SRFIs. And it has already achieved within 2 years, it's already achieved 10 trains per day, which DIRFT 1 succeeded in doing in about the same period, but DIRFT 1 achieved the 10 trains in the 10-year period, which other forecasts are based on. Northampton Gateway is forecasting 16 trains per day. Construction's about to start. East Midland Gateway, 16 trains per day forecast. 5 trains are already achieved within 2 years. West Midlands Interchange, we forecast 10 trains per day. Rail Central, which may or may not be coming forward, it's one of the proposed schemes rather than consented, had forecast 13 trains today in a very close location to East Midland Gateway, to Northampton Gateway and to DIRFT on the West Coast Main Line south of Rugby. Hinckley, just north of there, has also forecast 12 trains a day. These are very significant volumes and have an impact on the capacity on the strategic freight network. So time is constrained, but hopefully I've run you through some of the drivers for the increase in SRFIs resulting from the development of warehousing, the increased demand for it, the financial attractiveness of those investments for various parties. And it's a discussion now as to where some of the gaps might be, but the pressure to continue that trend is there. It's a government objective to achieve modal switch. That's a cross-party shared aim of all the main political parties. In order to achieve this, though, to achieve the success and to continue that success, it is absolutely vital that there is certainty and continued and increasing investment in the strategic freight network. Some areas are still underserved, and we'll come on to those on the panel, no doubt. But the new SRFIs are market-led. It's worth stressing that the planning policy that allows NSIP SRFIs to be approved specifically states that SRFI projects are taken forward by the market. There is no diktat set down in planning framework policy documents stating where these should be at the moment. They are market driven. That's what the national policy statement says. So that's a very quick overview to give you a feel for what's going on in the markets. And I'll hand back now to Maggie and take the slides down.
Peter, thank you very much. I'm discovering through this that that the office Wi-Fi is not as robust as my home Wi-Fi. So if I suddenly go video off, you'll know why. But thank you for taking us through that, and some really, really interesting information there on the interface between the demand for warehousing and the demand for SRFI. And I think some interesting questions there around planning policy and how the whole delivers for the needs of the logistics sector as well as for the rail freight industry. But let's just move on to our next speaker, David Meller from Prologis. Dave's busy at the moment helping build out the third phase of Daventry. And as Peter has already indicated to us, Daventry DIRFT has been, the poster boy, shall we say, of SRFI, the big success around which other sites have come forward and built themselves. So it's brilliant to see this additional investment going in. And Dave, over to you to take us through your slides and what's going on, what's happening, plans for the future, challenges and thoughts. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Maggie. And I think the first thing to say is I'm relieved that my stats seem to match up with Peter's on DIRFT, which is good news. So I will share my screen, which will hopefully work seamlessly. And start to try and present. So yeah, thanks Maggie and to the RFG for the invitation to come and speak to you all today. about developing major logistics hubs and especially the benefits of rail connected sites. And obviously this is all out of our experiences at Derft and continuing to develop at Derft. I'm part of the project management team at Prologis, and I manage logistics developments from site due diligence through the planning process or the development consent order process, and then ultimately through construction. For those of you that don't know Prologis, we are the largest owner and developer of logistics assets in the world, with total assets worth over $135 billion, which equates to about 1 billion square feet of buildings. They're all a bit sort of statty, but the one stat that always sticks in my mind, we calculated that the annual flow of goods through our warehouses actually equates to about 2.5% of global GDP. A significant part of my role and the largest project I'm looking after is managing the construction of all the infrastructure works and the expansion of Derft 3, which is the latest phase of our expansion at Derft, which is Prologis' largest development in the UK, and involves the construction of a new strategic rail freight interchange. So over the next sort of 10 minutes, I'll try and cover three areas really. One is really an overview of Derft and how Derft has grown. The construction of our expansion at Derft and our new strategic rail freight interchange, and we'll talk about some of the challenges that's brought about, and also the benefits of rail connected sites. So if we kick off with an overview of Derft. So firstly, for those that are unaware, Derft stands for Daventry International Rail Freight Terminal, but it actually isn't in Daventry. It's situated approximately 10 kilometres north of Daventry, right on junction 18 of the M1. So as Peter touched on, very close to the major motorway network, and also critically important, next to the Northampton loop of the West Coast Main Line. Derft's made up of 3 phases really. Derft 1, which is shown in blue, Derft 2 shown in red, and then Derft 3, which is expansion, shown in green. So in terms of the sort of chronology, in 1997 we opened.
Dave, sorry to interrupt. Could you you've got a big dialogue box that's showing up on your slides. I don't know if you can change the view or something. Sorry, we just can't see your maps.
It's a schoolboy error. I've got 2 screens and I've got it beautifully displayed on the other screen that clearly you guys can't see. Let me stop sharing and I'll restart. In fact, what I will do. I've tried to be too clever with 2 screens. That's the problem.
I can't handle one most of the time, so you're well ahead of me. That's much better, thank you.
Yeah. Is that still okay, Maggie?
That's perfect, thank you.
Okay, great. So yeah, apologies for that, everyone. Yeah, so Derft Railport, the original Railport, opened in 1997, and then between 97 and 2000, Derft saw development of 4.2 million square feet of industrial B8 space. Our journey with Derft started in 2006 when we acquired Derft. That's not all the buildings at Derft. We acquired the rail terminal, a lot of the road network, and critically the land for Derft 2. So DERF 2, the land shown in red, is when we really started developing with rail, and on the back of DERF's existing reputation as a strategic rail freight interchange. And when in 2011 we built 840,000 square feet for Tesco with their own dedicated rail terminal. Followed that up in 2015 with 1 million square foot for Sainsbury's, again with a dedicated rail terminal. So obviously some of the really big supermarkets switching, and were certainly the early adopters, particularly with Tesco. In 2014, we obtained our development consent order to expand DERFT and create DERF 3. But then before we actually physically started that, we finished off DERF 2 by building a 420,000 square foot unit for Eddie Stobart. So we currently have our existing multi-user rail port and 3 developments with their own rail terminals. But following obtaining our DCO in 2014, we now have consent and have started our expansion to DERFT to the north, that obviously we call DERF 3. So DERF 3, which is obviously highlighted in green on the previous slide, is neatly sandwiched between the M1 and the A5. And on the slide that you can see now, I apologise that the size and scale of the developments, it doesn't come across very easily on slides over Zoom. So you may have to zoom in a little bit or look closely and squint. But that does show our sort of proposed master plan. But in summary, the DERF 3 development comprises 7.8 million square feet of industrial B8 development, a new strategic rail freight interchange that will deliver up to 32 trains per day to the DERFT estate. We've got 800 metre long sidings, container throughput of circa 500,000 containers a year, and container storage of about 6,300 TEUs. Approximately 2 million square feet of the new development is either underway or completed, and that includes a new 845,000 square foot building for Royal Mail, which again, that has its own dedicated rail platform for them to move their goods and parcels around. There are several challenges to building new rail freight interchanges, to building such large developments. Not least just the sheer size of them. So in terms of general infrastructure, we have either completed or we will be completed by the end of the year to serve this. 3 million, we will have carried out 3 million cubic meters of moving earth around the site. That's primarily to create level platforms to build buildings off. We've built a 197 acre ecology reserve that we call Lilbourne Meadows. And that's to mitigate and provide a biodiversity net gain for the development. We'll have built 3.5 kilometres of roads and new utilities, a new 40 megawatt primary substation, a new roundabout on the A5, and a 300 space lorry park. And all of that is really before we've started building any rail. So the rail challenges that we have, we've got 8 kilometres of new track. We've got a rail traverser at the northern end of our terminal. The rail terminal itself has about 80,000 square meters of concrete pavement suitable for reach stackers, container storage, rubber-tied gantry cranes, really very flexible space, which I think is probably key in developing these things. We've required to put in 3 new bridges to actually to get the rail network linked up to our existing rail estate at DERFT, including one over the A5, over a tributary, and a rail underbridge below a bridleway. And we've also got a few buildings to build. We've got our training facility on site for logistics training. We've got a terminal control building, again at the northern end of our terminal, and a rail control building, which is the existing facility that we have in the rail port as it exists. And we also need to modify our existing reception sidings to increase capacity so we can get new services through to get them into DERF 3 and the increased traffic that will generate. So that's what we're planning to build. I've got a few progress shots. So this is looking at the center of the site northwards on the concrete aprons. You can see either side of the 800-meter rail terminal. There's about 850 meters of concrete there to give you a sense of scale. That's the bridge at the forefront of the picture is a rail bridge below the bridleway. Zooming in now a bit more to the end of the terminal, where we have a rail traverser to fit 800-meter sidings in. Sorry, to fit 800-meter sidings in, we're struggling for space. So to save space and save having a big fan at the northern end, we've actually put in a traverser, or we will put in a traverser, and you can also see our rail terminal control building at the end there. Oh, now the slides have gone. Excuse me. I will reshare any second. So hopefully you can see that again. So yeah, so we have a traverser at the northern end, and that's our traverser that's been built in the Meccan factory that you can see now. And then that's a bit of a general overview of the site. The building in the foreground is actually the new Royal Mail facility that I mentioned earlier. And these are shots of our bridge over the A5 going in, where we required a 1,000-ton crane, and we had to shut the A5 for a weekend. But that all lifted in was a bit of a challenge. And then finally, a last shot of the bridge and the beams all installed. But obviously, all of this work is currently underway. We are moving and progressing well on site, and we should be complete by the end of this year with our new rail terminal available for use and available to accept trains. So I've talked about a little bit or described what we're building, but I guess why we're building it is a different topic, and I appreciate that we're potentially preaching to the converted for a lot of people here or within this virtual room. But nonetheless, I think it's probably worth just covering the benefits and why we're doing this. So I think the three main benefits we could summarize into reliability, sustainability, and accessibility. So, I mean, reliability, rail freight and departure on time performance on the network is over 95%. We hear a lot about rail delays, but we don't actually consider what it does well often enough, I don't think. If you import containerized freight, there's a good chance rail already undertakes part of the journey, particularly to the Midlands and North, with around 25% of all containers through Felixstowe now departing by train. There's been historic industry focus on passenger services, and they've seen significant growth over the last 25 years. However, freight has also been growing, with around 45% of all freight traffic now being carried by consumer goods. Freight is no longer anonymous. It's our consumption, our clothing, our household goods, and our evening meal. So the desk you may be working at the moment, or the monitor that you're watching me on, may at some point have travelled by rail and possibly even passed through a Prologis building. Freight trains are carrying new types of containerized traffic, longer length units and curtain-side swap bodies. So there's an option to deliver most types of cargo. And in terms of sustainability, as businesses wrestle with their own ambitious targets around net zero carbon, and consumers demand even more information about the sustainable credentials of all the products they're consuming and buying, one thing is certain: the method of transport used at every stage of the supply chain process will matter more than ever, and the rail freight has an important part to play in helping the industry get ahead of the carbon curve. In the UK, 1 in 4 sea containers arriving or departing from a port is carried by rail. Each freight train removes 17,000 lorries from the UK's roads every year, resulting in 994 million fewer HGV miles every year. This is equivalent to over 2,000 trips to the moon and back. Rail generates 24% of the equivalent road carbon emissions for every tonne moved. Longer trains at 775 metres that DIRFT is especially designed to cater for are even more efficient and remove further carbon emissions. What is more is the UK freight is poised to play a much bigger sustainability role in the coming years. Currently, 95% of rail freight mileage is diesel. However, if a rolling programme of rail electrification is introduced, this will bring further significant environmental gains. Accessibility, the last sort of benefit, I guess, and I think probably one that people don't appreciate. You don't have to be a large supermarket to take advantage of everything rail freight has to offer. UK rail freight is surprisingly cost-effective means of transport for smaller companies who can choose to move single container loads or explore sharing loads with another company. This can help achieve cost savings and drive efficiencies. Being at DIRFT or close to it with a common user terminal or a strategic rail freight interchange means more opportunities to share loads and fewer miles. So in summary, rail freight is over 95% reliable and equals or betters road haulage. Every train removes 76 HGVs from the roads and runs at 24% of the carbon emissions. It cuts road deaths and can be used by customers on a small or large scale basis. With the world heading towards decarbonisation within the next 10 to 15 years, now is the time to future-proof and start using rail. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. That's really interesting, and it's fantastic to see the third stage of DIRF going up. I was travelling up the M1 recently, and I was getting quite excited because you can see it from the motorway now. So it's great to see that. Right, Guy and Nick and Peter, if you wanted to go video on, and we'll move towards a panel discussion. But before we start on that, Guy, you were off video first. Do you just want to introduce yourself and say a couple of words of intro?
By all means, yes. Can you hear me?
We can.
Good, excellent. Yeah, thanks, Maggie. Yeah, interesting presentations. I don't think I'm going to say anything that's at odds with those, really. But just to say, really, Network Rail support the development of SRFIs. They're great value for the taxpayer because we don't pay anything. And they are absolutely necessary to affect the modal shift that we're all desirous of, both in terms of our own targets for achieving modal shift growth in this control period, but more generally with a view to 2050. They are freight stations in the same way as we get directly involved with railheads and facilities for the bulk construction sector. Intermodal is the other big pillar of growth. But I think the important thing to note as well for SRFIs and rail connected warehousing more generally is they have a role to play for the other emerging sectors that we see in rail freight with express freight and high-speed parcels, that kind of traffic. Again, you don't get that sort of traffic to rail unless you've got somewhere to put it to rail. And so that's a role that I think SRFIs can play. I think the only other point I would make is that network capacity permitting, it's also worth considering the B end of the journey, if you like. There will be traffic growth between a greater disposition of SRFIs, but equally it's appropriate, and I think Peter alluded to this in his slide, there are some areas of the country where the SRFI model can't work because of planning restrictions or a lack of demand for warehousing, but the advent of a rail terminal of some description to handle traffic either into the SRFI system or from the SRFIs, that kind of regional interchange in some places is something we do need to look at. Whether we become better equipped to do that in the new world order with a GBR, who knows, but that would certainly be something positive to come out of this. So yeah, we're broadly in support of them, just conscious of the time here. I'll let Nick get a word in edgeways. Thank you.
Thanks, Guy. And Nick, a word in edgeways.
Yes, my hallmark, some might say, who know me. Nick Gallop from Intermodality. We've hung around the necks of SRFIs across the country and still continue to do so. Yeah, just listening into all of that, and the points have been gradually ticked off as we've gone through, so I'll keep this nice and simple. A quick bit of back of fact packet calculations suggests that even if you threw every single SRFI into the mix right now, including the ones that are but a glint in the eye of a developer, my calculations reckon we're still only about 15% of the total market for big sheds and floor space in the country. So this question about do we need extra rail served floor space? Well, it's clear from Peter and Dave's presentation that there is more floor space coming because we all keep consuming more and more, something we have to explain at the local level sometimes as to why these things need to be built, because we keep buying stuff. And every time we want something delivered tomorrow, it's got to be somewhere close to where they can deliver it tomorrow, if not today. So there is a market that will continue to grow. I think the Savills data for last week was talking about a 6-fold increase in take up by online retailers. That's probably just the start. So if the government remains committed to at least the forecast talking about 1/3 of the nation's floor space being rail served by 2043, we're only halfway there. And that's assuming every single one that's out there at the moment makes it through. Hence why a need for several more, I suspect. Worth again remembering, because we get asked this a lot, particularly at inquiries and things, aren't these just white elephants? Well, no, because every single SRFI that's been opened and operational has delivered new rail freight traffic. So here's an example of the commercial sector delivering on that public policy aspiration. It does what it says on the tin. Build one of these things and I have to say they do come. And they increasingly come at scale, as East Midlands Gateway and iPort will have demonstrated. It's also helped create a whole domestic intermodal market. And by domestic, I mean non-port intermodal. And you could argue, of course I would, wouldn't I? But you would argue, and so would Dave probably, that without SRFIs, Tesco wouldn't be doing the number of trains per day it's doing now and wouldn't be wanting to double that over the coming years. So going forward, notes in the margin, I think we continue to build on the principles of the national policy statement. Actually, that has proved incredibly valuable over recent years, and anything that could be done to emphasize it has delivered and people have delivered in response be a good thing, and to hard lock that into the strategic freight network so the two go forward hand in glove. One thing I would say, a bit of a plea, is for industry to step up and be there when some of these big schemes are going through the planning process, particularly those outside of the rail industry. It is quite depressing sometimes when a scheme falls over, only for months later, as has happened at least once, for a retailer or a logistics company to come forward and go, any chance for any rail served floor space in insert name of place, to which we always say, well, if you'd been there, might have helped to convince the planning inspector. But anyway, as Guy said or alluded to, there are new tools coming out in Network Rail's toolbox, PACE and SPEED, and probably more acronyms yet to come. If they can be used to control costs of gaining access to the rail network in the first place, that would be most welcome, helping perhaps smaller scale schemes come forward. And finally, again, a plea to all of the operators, I think, of these facilities, is that this is not about creating, well, I would argue it is not about creating a network of independent sites that are all individually hardwired to Felixstowe, Southampton, London Gateway. The MPS talks about a network. Continental Europe operates to a network. So I think where possible, encouraging operators and users to run this as a network, designing new facilities so they're not a dead end, so that you can do multi-drop services, building them as pit lanes, not as cul-de-sacs, will help that in no small part. But otherwise, onwards, upwards.
Thanks, Nick. Okay, great. So we've got a few questions coming in, but let me just start with a couple, if I may, whilst we warm up. You know, we've talked about the success of the Planning Act in bringing new SRFIs through, and Peter, you alluded to the difficulties of having land in local plans. Is this really about a failure of the conventional planning system?
Yeah, warehousing has never been that popular. It's not a vote winner. People haven't seen it as a great asset for the region, but they've underestimated the quality of the jobs that are being created now, and the diversity of the jobs in finance, IT, all the automation that's coming in has required a different type of employee. There's still a good spread of jobs in the warehousing, but I think that's been the main reason why local plans haven't allocated things. And they've hoped that neighbouring local planning authorities will do so instead of them, and the end result's been no one's done anything. And
is that why? I mean, obviously SRFIs go through a different regime if they're at scale, and is that a reason why in some parts of the country where a smaller facility might work, we're not getting them?
Smaller facilities, I think that's probably true. I think that is a fair comment. It does vary a lot across the country though, and some parts of the country are, you know, some local authorities do see the benefit of smaller local rail terminals, but quite often that's been a reaction to sort of try and prevent a larger one. But I think there is a very good case to be made for an increased number of smaller rail terminals as well, just to help spread the internal coverage.
And Dave and Nick, I mean, I'm going to ask the question now, which I think we all know the answer to, but let me ask it anyway, because I think it's important. Why are so many SRFIs in the Midlands and South Yorkshire?
Because they're uniquely placed to serve the entire country. The size and investment required for them is obviously pretty significant, and moving big boxes around the country is it's just the location. They're close to that network, and we can serve anywhere. That national distribution model works on the back of strategic rail freight interchanges. Sorry,
Dave. I think it's a question that we usually get asked at fairly charged local public meetings. Why here? Why all these sheds here? I think there is sometimes, and it's mainly because this is not a criticism, it's an observation that most of the people who suddenly face an SRFI or a big distribution park, whether it's road or rail served on their doorstep, that aren't familiar with warehousing because it's an industry like the rail freight sector that doesn't really broadcast what it does. It isn't really top gear territory in terms of people's attention, sadly. And it is a case of having to go back and explain that developers do not just go around the Midlands, Yorkshire and the Northwest, just putting up big tin sheds for the hell of it, and then running off and hoping that someone else is going to fill them with HGVs and people. It is in response to demand. It is in response to occupiers actually having requirements. There are some fairly chunky ones out there at the moment in Yorkshire and Humberside and the Northwest for large footprint buildings where rail connection would be useful or encouraged. So I think it's about trying to get the messaging right, that these don't just pop up in the countryside because an architect feels that they want some kind of epitaph. It's because for all of us that buy all this stuff and demand ever increasing range and ever increasing availability, usually same day or next day, that you have to store that somewhere. And these are the sort of places where the occupiers want to be, and people like Dave and Peter then respond to that.
Okay, look, let me turn to some of the questions that are coming in. There's sort of one for Guy here, I think, which I'm going to generalise. A question from Simon about whether SRFIs are supporting longer trains up to 775 metres. But more generally, Guy, the interface between aspirations on the network and the design and development of SRFIs, are we as aligned as we need to be?
I think that's a fair point. I mean, I don't think I've come across an SRFI development that hasn't, from the outset, considered at least 775 metre train running or 750 trailing. And the majority of them are proposed on lines of route where that capability already exists. Most of our deep sea ports are capable of dispatching trains in that kind of order of length. And where we have sought to remodel or are seeking to remodel some of our yards in the nodal yard kind of program, those two are typically north of 700 metre length capability as well. So I think that there has long been a rally around the 775 flag in the intermodal sector that has both influenced the evolution of the network and also the design and configuration of SRFIs. So I think it's pretty well joined up in that regard. That isn't to say there aren't areas of the country where you don't quite get that length and where we do need to do work. And I think the other thing that we have experienced over the last 12 months or so is that a quieter network enables you to run a greater number of trains at a greater length because you're not forever being looped and dawdling along behind a stopping passenger service. So that, I feel, is probably, having spent a decade doing gauge clearance and train lengthening works, having finished in Easter at Southampton, I think the next big challenge is going to be capacity, and capacity that you can use for a decent economically viable length train. That, as I see it, is the challenge over the next 5 years or so.
Thanks, Guy. Okay, a question here. What is the scope for rail-air combined logistics? How close might rail sidings need to be to airports to make that work? Anyone got any thoughts on rail-air? I know we haven't got EMG on the call. They are, of course, adjacent to the runway. Peter, any thoughts?
Yeah, I'm not that much of an expert in air freight, I'll have to say, but from what I know, it seems to be a high value but relatively low volume product.
I don't know whether Peter's sharing your Wi-Fi, Maggie. I don't know, but yeah. I guess that is a segue for express freight, which is a air freight alternative offer, I guess, that you exploit speed and directness that rail can offer if the powers are there to compete with an air freight offer. Obviously, there would be a challenge about are their terminals proximate to airports, but I think in terms of the technical capabilities of rail, they should be able to have a fighting chance at tackling that network, that offer.
Thank you. Dave, one for you. It's a technical question, but I think there's a wider point as well, which the question is there scope to electrify the branch beyond the reception roads connecting DERF? Sorry, is there scope to electrify the branch beyond the DERF reception roads connecting 2 and 3 to avoid the use of shunters for electric multiple units? But the question I think behind that is about the potential for high-speed logistics into DERF, and particularly, obviously, we've got customers like Royal Mail and others going in there. Any thoughts on that market?
Yeah, and we've always considered whether we should look to electrify further into DERF. I mean, clearly we can't go into terminals because loading and offloading containers with overhead lines is problematic. But I think in terms of the future, we probably see that battery-powered shunting locos or so is probably the sustainable way forward, rather than electrifying all of our private rail network. But anything is possible, and if the demand moves that way, then we've certainly made sure we haven't limited ourselves in terms of clearances under bridges. So I would say never, but we don't have any immediate plans. And I think from a sustainability perspective, we probably see hybrid or battery-powered locos, shunting being the probably the preferable option, and certainly in the short term.
Thanks, Dave. Okay, we are up on time, but we're going to go through the questions. I think if people need to drop off, then do. But question from a port perspective, we're trying to understand the implications for growth in the number of smaller rail terminals around the UK. Does this risk fragmentation of rail services rather than making it possible to serve everybody daily? I guess, Guy, that's a question in terms of network capacity, really, isn't it? To some degree.
Yeah, I think we'd be going some to end up with too many terminals and dilute the train service element a bit. I think that'd be a great position to be in. I think at the moment there is not a sufficient disposition of terminal facilities to realise the level of growth we actually require. If that was a question aimed at the end destination, no, I don't think it was. So I'm not quite sure where that question's headed at, but I don't think we're anywhere close to, and Nick's alluded to it already, anywhere close to having too many, and therefore diffusing the rail offer too thinly.
Okay, and then the last question we've got in the Q&A. The question, will a switch to Great British Railway make it easier to ensure the rail network capacity can cater for where new warehouses will be built, especially if the percentage of large warehouses rises across the UK? So will moving through rail reform help us get those SRFIs where we need them, I guess, the heart of that?
If I could comment on that, one of my hopes, and I think it's probably the sector of GBR, is if it is at once responsible for specifying the passenger service and also being legally responsible for promoting rail freight, it does suggest those two sometimes conflicting forces will at least be under the same roof. And so one might hope there'd be some strategic thought put to ensuring that there is sufficient network capacity for freight growth in amongst the specification for a passenger service, in contrast to today's situation where DfT determine, or elements of DfT determine what the passenger service frequency should be, and then freight happens afterwards and tries to have to fit in. And actually over the period of evolution of an SRFI, once it's been through all the planning hurdles and everything else, you can go from a position of, you would have been throwing a sausage up Oxford Street when you started your planning application to when it's finally built, the railway's full of everything else. So I think that coordination is probably something we should reasonably expect and look forward to with GBR.
And I think one of the things for me that was helpful in the white paper was a clear recognition of the private investment that comes with rail freight, yep, and that continuing to be something that government would support and encourage going forward, and rightly that they should, but in a white paper which is much more about bringing things into a concession model in the passenger railway, understanding the dynamic of freight being very different, and supporting that investment is key. Colleagues, any other thoughts then on sort of what happens next in the future, or what you'd like to see happening next in the future, perhaps, as we move into either rail reform or planning reform or anything else?
I think history has proven that government policy tends to work in cycles. We seem to be in quite a good place in that cycle at the moment. The National Policy Statement, the Planning Act, the responses that the Planning Inspectorate have given, the examining authorities on development consent orders have given over the last 4 DCOs, all of which have gone through. As Mike Hatfield has said on the comments, even East Midlands Gateway, which the examining authority wasn't that keen on and recommended refusal, Secretary of State had other views. So I think to be in a place where there isn't this constant having to try and get public bodies up the learning curve to understand how these things work, and then to try and get sensible, coherent decisions, I would say if you look at the last 4 of those DCO decisions, and answering another question that I think has been given about, can't developers just welch their way out of putting these connections in? Well, read the development consent orders and you'll see just how difficult if not impossible, that would be. So I think we're seeing evolution of government policy and the people executing it, actually understanding it and getting it now. So given these things are cyclical and it doesn't take long for change of administration, change of attitude, you know, onshore wind very quickly became offshore wind because it got politically awkward. I think it's just keeping an eye open for anything that might come in that regard that tries to separate out the need for warehousing in general to suit us all as consumers and the economy as to how much of that needs to be rail served. Because I think the evidence base is very strong and we just need to keep broadcasting that.
Nick, thank you. And I'm going to call the panel to a stop here because we've committed the webinar till 2 o'clock and it's already 5 past. And, you know, people I know have got other things in their diaries. So let me just sort of try and wrap up there. And there are a couple of unanswered questions that we'll take offline. And thank you for all your questions. But I think, you know, what we've heard today is that demand for warehousing is not going away. It is getting more. And as I always reflect, if you put a warehouse on a rail link site, you've got a chance of serving it by rail. And if you put a warehouse on a road-fed site, then frankly, you haven't. So the case for SRFIs is, I think, well made. But what we've got to do is make sure that we continue to justify that and to align and coordinate better between the planning framework and the rail planning framework and have the right support in place to keep that private investment coming in the way that we need it. And of course, building on the success that we've seen at places like iPort and EMG and of course DERFT, and looking forward to seeing more of that as DERFT moves out, as Royal Mail's warehouse and others come on site, and indeed at the other locations that we know are in development now. But for me then, it's just to say a huge thank you to Dave and to Peter and to Nick and to Guy for their participation today. Thank you to all of those of you who've come online and asked questions. We will pick up the remaining questions before we part and come back to you on email if we can. If you want a copy of today's slides, please email me or Yvonne and we will get those over to you. And the webinar will go up on the YouTube channel fairly shortly and you'll be able to find it there when you have a look. If you just Google for Rail Freight Group channel, you'll find it on there. And do look out for our next webinar on reform on the 23rd of June and also for upcoming webinars this side of the summer as well into July. But thank you all very much for your attending. Virtual round of applause to all our panelists and speakers, to whom thank you all very much. And see you all again soon. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon in the sunshine. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Maggie.